Hi class. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to find the percent of a number. So let's start with these numbers here that have percents that are greater than 1%. So here I have 10% of 600. So before I start any of these questions, I always ask myself this one question. What would 100% of 600 be? What is 100% of 600? And the answer should be 600 because, and this is a very important rule to follow, 100% of any number is that same number. So 100% of 600 is 600. 100% of 100 is 100. 100% of 200 is 200, etc., etc. So once I know that 100% of 600 is 600, I'm going to be asked to find 10% of 600. So 10% of 600, meaning if I break down 600 into 10 parts and I add them back together, what can I get? So if you think about it conceptually, 10% of 600 should be 60, right? Because 60 times 10 is 600. Or if you add 60 10 times, so 10 parts of 60, you add it all together, you get back to 600. Another way to think about it is this. If I ever write 10% of 600, what's essentially happening is taking the 600 and I'm dividing it by 10. And remember, anytime we divide a number by 10, we move the decimal place a certain amount. So when we divide a number by 10, the decimal place starts here and we move it one place over to the left-hand side. So my answer should simply be 60.0 or just simply 60. So that's why we get 60 when we ask for 10% of 600. Okay, great. We just found that one. What would 20% of 600 be then? Now, 20% of 600. Now, would you guys agree? For 20% of 600, essentially, I'm going to have, if I take 10% and I add it to 10%, I'm simply going to get 20%. So if 10% plus 10% is 20%, well, I know what 10% is. 10% is of 60, 10% of 600 is 60. So I'm simply going to add 60 together twice because 10% plus 10% is 20%. Well, 60 plus 60 is actually 120. Hence, 20% of 600 should be 120. Now, let's look for 30% of 600. So, same idea here. 20% was 10% plus 10%. 30% would simply be 10% plus 10% plus 10%. So that should get me 30%. I know what 10% is going to be. It's 60. So I simply add 60 together 3 times. And upon doing so, I'm going to get my answer for 30% of 600, which is going to be 180, because 60 plus 60 plus 60 is 180. Okay, now we move on to another very important situation, 1% of 600. So basically, how many 1% do I need to add together to get 10%? 10 of them. So basically, if 10% of 600 is 60, what can I divide? And I'm going to divide 60 into 10 parts. What would I get? 6. I would get 6. So my answer here for 1% of 600 should simply be 6. As for y, well, if I take 6 and add it together by itself 10 times, I get 60. Another way to think about it is this. Similar to how I wrote it down for 10%, if I simply was looking for 1% of 600, what's essentially happening is I start with 600, and instead of dividing it by 10 this time, I'm dividing by 10 twice, or I'm basically dividing by 100. Now, anytime you divide by 100, remember, you have to move the decimal place a certain amount, not once, but twice. So when you divide by 10, you move the decimal place 1 to the left. When you divide by 100, you move the decimal place 2 to the left. So hence, my new decimal place should be right here now, 6.00. So my final answer should be 6 for that reason. I believe for finding percents of a number, if you know how to find 100% of that number, 10% of that number, and 1% of that number, you should be able to find the rest or figure out the rest. Now, let's move on and find 2% of a number. So 2% of 600, well, same idea here. If I know what 1% is, right, I should know what 2% is because 2% is simply 1% plus 1%. So 1% of 600 was 6. So I'm going to add 1% and 1% together, meaning I'm going to add 6 and 6 together, and I'm going to get 12. Hence, 2% of 600 is simply 12. Okay, now for 20% of 600. I put it down here twice to show you another way of finding it, simply with the 1%. So essentially, if I know what 1% is, I can add it together by itself 20 times, or I can simply multiply it by 20. Now, if I multiply 1% by 20, I'm simply going to get 20%, which is what I'm looking for. So hence, if I had 1% is 6, and I times 6 by 20, 6 times 20 is simply going to be 120. Hence, 20% of 600 is 120. Just like how we got it here, but we used 10% instead. Now we decide to use 1% to get it here. Basically, 1% is the smaller percent. It is, if you figure out what 1% is, you can pretty much figure out what all the other percentages are. So it's probably the better way to go about these situations. But some students can't figure out how to get to 1%. So then we show them how to use 10% instead as well. And sometimes it just might be faster if you're looking for something like 20%, just to find 10% and add it together twice. Okay, moving on to 5% of 600. Okay, so this one you have to think about it conceptually here. You know what 10% is. 10% of 600 is simply 60. Now, would you guys agree? If I divide 10% by 2, I'm simply going to halve the 10% to get 5%. So, if I know that 10% is 60, and I divide 60 by 2, I'm just going to get 30. Hence, 5% of 600 is 30. Okay, now let's look for 25% of 600. So for 25%, well, I know what 20% is. It's 120. I know what 5% is. It's 30. Why don't I just add them together? So now 20% plus 5% is simply 25%. So now 20% was 120, 5% was 30. I'm going to add it together. 120 plus 30 is simply going to be 150. So 25% of 600 is 150. And hopefully this gives you a good idea of how to find percents of a number.